Hey class, welcome back to Psychology of Adjustment. We are moving from chapter 3, talking about stress, and now we're looking at sort of the follow-up chapter to that. Obviously chapter 4 numerically, but also thinking about how do we cope with stress and looking at various processes with how we deal or cope with the stress around us. Because I think in the last chapter I mentioned, hey, stress is inevitable. So how do we deal with it? Like, we all experience stress to some degree. We all need stress to some degree in order to, get out of bed and accomplish really anything. We have to experience stress. So we'll talk about, good ways, bad ways of coping. And so initially, this first section is going to be looking at defining what coping is. So the concept of coping. So by the end of this chapter or the section of the chapter, you should be able to describe the variety of coping strategies people use, understand also why it is beneficial to use a wide variety of coping strategies and how those strategies will differ in terms of their adaptive value. I think about coping as it's kind of like a toolbox. The more tools you can have in your toolbox, the more effective you can be as a handy person. If you only have a hammer in your toolbox, your ability to help out, let's say like around the house, is very limited. Of course, there are going to be some times where you need a hammer and that'll work just fine, but that obviously isn't going to, work for every single, housing problem as a metaphor. So more tools equals more ways to cope, whatever way you want to think about that. So coping is just, our textbook looks at sort of coping, stress is a response. Coping is how we master, reduce, or tolerate those demands that are created by stress. So when a demand is placed upon our resources, coping is how we either deal with the stressor itself, reduce the stress, or tolerate it, just simply deal with it. So, and some things you might want to consider is that people will vary quite a bit in terms of their ability to cope. There's a lot of different ways to cope. There are adaptive ways to coping, and those coping strategies will vary in terms of the value. Like, there are better strategies for coping than others. So now we'll kind of move on and look at some of the common coping patterns, the ones that have limited value. So you will, after this section of the chapter, will analyze the adaptive value of giving up as a response to stress, the adaptive value of aggression. You'll also look at the adaptive value of indulging yourself, the adaptive value of self-blame, and evaluate the adaptive value of defense mechanisms. Some of those maybe might be familiar from, talking about Freud in previous chapters or in intro psych. So one thing, if you count a stressful problem, one way to deal with it is just simply to give up. And that is, for the most part, not the best way to solve a problem, especially with time. If you're used to giving up, eventually people, if they're so used to just kind of, that's their, typical response to stress, people might eventually develop what is called learned helplessness, basically where you become very passive when exposed to stressful events, basically seeing them as unavoidable and just kind of going with it and not really trying to exert any force to change the situation. So, and in some cases, that can be transferred to situations in which the person really isn't helpless. So again, it's learned. You are learning how to cope in a way that is somewhat detrimental. Actually, it is very detrimental. That is sort of your default pattern. So anytime you encounter stressful events, rather than being kind of active in the problem solving, the individual might be passive. In fact, may not even really engage in any kind of way to cope with the stress. And ultimately, this comes from how do we interpret events, especially aversive events that might stress us out or, tax our resources. And that initial interpretation or appraisal is oftentimes kind of that initial determinant whether we feel like, I'm helpless or not. If people adopt more of a pessimistic explanatory style when it comes to explaining aversive events, they're more likely to feel out of control and feel helpless, as opposed to maybe, optimistic. And adopting this kind of strategy or explanatory style is also conducive for behavioral disengagement, not directly dealing with the stress, being very passive and inactive, which also is with the goal is to reduce stress. This strategy actually is associated with more stress, so it's kind of counterintuitive. In some cases, giving up can be adaptive. Obviously, hey, giving up smoking. If you're someone who is like, hey, I'm a smoker and I don't know what to do. Well, I would say number one, give up. That is the perfect time to give up. No. Also, when goals become unrealistic, if you're working towards a goal, it's one thing to be optimistic and it's another thing to be unrealistically optimistic. If you see a goal that you think as something that you can accomplish, but turns out there's a lot of evidence that maybe you can't, then giving up in that sense can be adaptive. It may lead to where you stop wasting resources, time, things like that. So, I mean, there are some cases, but for the most part, giving up, it may be better though, instead of saying giving up though, if that's the case, is looking at it as a goal adjustment. I think reframing can actually change the way you interpret that event or those events. Another way we can cope is to act aggressively. So especially when we get frustrated, we can vent and let that frustration out. Frustrating events, sitting in traffic, being stuck in, really cold, really hot weather, adverse weather, things like that could lead to aggression where we might want to physically or verbally harm someone. We might lash out in terms of that aggression towards other people, whether they deserve it or not. And in fact, yeah, a lot of times we might, someone makes us mad at work. We get frustrated at some, our partner or dog or sibling or somebody at home instead. Freudian talked about there are substitute, when we act out in this way, like let's say our boss makes us mad and we go home and take it out on our partner, our girlfriend, boyfriend, husband, wife, partner, whoever. Freud would call this displacement. You're unconsciously carrying that anger, that frustration from one scenario to another. And displacing it. Maybe you're upset at traffic. You're getting really frustrated, getting stuck in traffic like this gentleman here. You go home and get upset with your loved ones instead. So Freud actually talked about, the release of aggressive impulses of frustration as a form of catharsis, and talked about this as a positive thing. However, there's a lot of research that shows that acting aggressively, like letting that frustration out, actually can lead to more aggression and anger, not less. And there's some really interesting research by Anderson et al. That looks at video games and the relationship to aggression. There is actually a pretty interesting correlation between media violence and aggression. Like the more individuals consume media violence, whether that's video games, TV shows, whatever, we do see, a higher correlation in aggressive behavior, but that is not implying causation. In fact, there is that correlation research, but if we dig below the surface, typically there are other variables at play. For example, like home family dynamics is a really big factor that, not everybody who consumes violent media is going to be aggressive and be violent for that matter. So I think we have to be really careful about it, how we interpret these results. There is a relationship, but we need to be more nuanced in how we interpret and understand that relationship. Another way you can cope with stress is self-indulgence, indulging yourself, or like in Parks and Rec, treat yourself. And like go take your, like if you had a hard day and you decide, okay, I'm going to go out and take myself out to my favorite meal and just kind of unwind. Like that's not a big deal. Or maybe I'm going to go to the mall and buy myself something nice because I'm kind of feeling stressed. In small doses, that's probably fine. But when it becomes, not so good is when we look at things like self-indulgence in form of excessive eating, drinking, smoking, gambling, drug use, internet use. Like not only, so it's one thing to say like, okay, I'm going to buy myself like, a new book to cope with stress. I had a stressful day, so maybe I'll go out and buy a new book. To kind of make myself feel better. But there obviously can be a limit. There could be, more to that when you are spending an excessive amount of money or time on the internet, shopping, buying things like, that's when it can become overindulgent and can become dysfunctional. Spending more time on our phones, the more time we're kind of self-indulging in our internet lives, the less time we have to interact with our loved ones and the people around us. And that actually, there's a lot of evidence that shows that's good for coping with stress. Another common technique for dealing with stress or common coping pattern is to simply blame ourselves. When we fail, when we don't succeed, when we don't reach our goals, oftentimes individuals will become highly critical of themselves, especially when they're stressed. Albert Ellis, kind of one of the pioneers of cognitive therapy, talked about, catastrophic thinking, always kind of looking at the worst of ourselves and the situation, focusing on the negative side of things, being pessimistic as opposed to optimistic. These are potential, areas where, can lead to distress, dysfunction, and even disorder in terms of like anxiety, depression, and things like that. So, Ellis, like Albert Ellis talks about, when we have these self-blame, it's associated with more stress, increased depression, heightened PTSD symptoms, and shame, especially when it comes to sexual abuse, blaming yourself or something like that, increased depression and anxiety among those with serious health issues, like if you're blaming yourself for your health, for example. So a lot of mental health concerns kind of come, from this sort of catastrophic blaming yourself kind of coping pattern. Another way to cope with stress is through defense mechanisms, sort of another Freudian idea that we have these unconscious reactions that we use to kind of insulate and protect ourselves from feelings of anxiety, guilt, and shame. They shield us. They're a protective force, so to speak, psychological force to shield us from emotional discomfort. However, a lot of times there's a large degree of self-deception or distortion of reality needed for these defense mechanisms to actually work. So for example, denial, refusing to acknowledge an unpleasant event. So an example might be a student allows their family to plan a trip for their graduation, even though she is failing a class that is required to graduate. You're just simply denying the fact that, this very big, thing in the way could prevent me from even having this trip. So there's all kinds of different common defense mechanisms. I'm not going to go over all of these, but you can take a look at these and read for them yourselves. Defense mechanisms are, for the most part, normal, and obviously they can sort of operate at various levels of consciousness. Freud looked at it mostly as an unconscious force, but for the most part, it can happen at pre-conscious, unconscious, conscious levels. Can they be healthy? Generally, no, not for the most part, especially because they are avoidance strategies rather than dealing with the problem. They're oftentimes associated with avoidance. They might also involve wishful thinking, which kind of sounds like optimism, but it's one thing to be optimistic, to be wishful thinking, but it's another thing to be actively participating in your own coping. Baumeister talks about how, there is a certain degree of self-delusion, self-deception that is kind of helpful, but at a certain point, it can become maladaptive. So overall, not so good. Constructive coping, things that are good in terms of the nature of coping. So we'll talk about the nature of constructive coping and distinguish among the three categories of constructive coping. We talked about the poor ways to cope. Now let's talk about the research-based evidence, good ways to cope. So when we say constructive coping, it's referring to efforts that are intended to directly deal with a stressful event. And these are judged to be relatively healthful and helpful, especially when we're talking about compared to some of these other methods we talked about previously. So constructive coping typically involves confronting problems directly, not trying to avoid them, direct effort, not being passive, realistic appraisal of the stress, like, okay, realistically, is this a stressor? And what sort of resources does the individual have? And learning to recognize and manage disruptive and emotional reactions to stress, being able to recognize, I'm getting stressed and I'm doing these things. Maybe I need to, take some steps to actively cope. And then learning to exert control over those potentially harmful and destructive patterns. Like, when you get stressed out and realizing, okay, I'm stressed and my first reaction is I want to go drink or I want to go smoke a cigarette, and realizing, okay, there are better things that I can do with my time and resources to cope. And for our textbook and for this course, we're going to look at three categories for constructive coping. There is appraisal focused, problem focused, and emotion focus. And you can think about, these are three different ways we can tackle a stressful situation. So these are all constructive. So appraisal would be, detecting and being aware of negative self-talk, engaging in rational thinking, positive reinterpretation of the stress. It is really getting at, how do we think about and interpret the event? Problem-focused strategies are involved directly active problem solving, reaching out for social support, coping via regulating time management, like actively being better at time management. There's emotion focused coping that might be releasing pent up emotions. And that doesn't necessarily mean like I'm angry, therefore I'm going to go punch somebody or something. It could be simply telling somebody like, hey, I'm really angry right now. I'm really frustrated right now. Distracting yourself. So maybe you're upset about something and you go watch your favorite show on Netflix, exercise, meditation. A lot of times, if we can use one or more of these strategies, depending on the stressor, depending on the scenario, these are good things to do when it comes to dealing with stress. Okay, so now let's specifically look at appraisal focus. So we'll go back to Ellis. By the end of this section, you should be able to explain rational thinking as an appraisal focused coping strategy, the merits of humor in coping with stress, and assess the positive reinterpretation and benefit finding as an appraisal focused coping strategy. So Ellis, we talked about him earlier. He has the ABC model when it comes to dealing with stress. We have A is that initial appraisal, like realizing, is this a stressful event or not? Negative appraisals or beliefs are oftentimes like if we appraise something to be negative. I think my dog is barking, sorry. Let me go check real quick. Pumpkin, you okay? Pumpkin, come here. One sec. You okay? You're all good. Sorry, dog's fine. She was just barking at somebody. You can fast forward through this. When we are able to appraise the situation through the beliefs, we have appraisal, then beliefs, being more positive or optimistic is more conducive to that constructive type of coping. So the A, kind of the common sense view, experience a stressor, and we have a consequence. So we have A, the activating event, which is stressor. So in this case, someone stands you up on a date. The consequence, you're angry. You have this emotional turmoil. And that's typically how we view these events. Albert Ellis says, okay, how about we focus on what's happening in between A and C? So we have A, the activating event, we get stood up. B, we have this belief system. The irrational appraisal is this is terrible. I'm going to have a boring weekend. I'll never find anyone. And that leads to emotional turmoil. A more rational, optimistic, realistic interpretation is, experience the stress. This is unfortunate. It sucks, but guess what? I can still salvage my weekend. And guess what? Maybe the date didn't work out now, but maybe that's for the better. Someday I could find somebody who's more mature and dependable, who shows up on the dates they plan. And this leads to a more calm emotional state. Maybe you're annoyed, but you're not angry. You're not agitated. You're not dejected. And perhaps you're even remaining hopeful about your prospects. So this really gets at to that interpretation, which leads to beliefs or leads to catastrophic thinking. So this unrealistic negative appraisals leading to these irrational assumptions. And these might be, for example, I must have love and affection from certain people or all people. I must perform well in all endeavors. Other people should always behave competently and be considerate of me. Events should always go. So when we get stuck in that kind of thinking, we're more likely to develop some of those negative emotional consequences as a response. We can reduce that catastrophic thinking by, one, being aware that it's happening, by just learning to detect that it's happening, learning to dispute and challenge those assumptions, diffusing the stressful situation with humor, finding a way to laugh at something or yourself or anything else, reinterpreting that stressful event in a positive light. So in the case of the missed date, instead of being angry, you say, oh, well, maybe this worked out for the better. Maybe this person's not the kind of person I want to date. They stood me up, so obviously not. So maybe I'm can find somebody better. Humor, a lot of evidence shows, research shows that humor can lessen the impact of stress. It creates more opportunities for positive appraisal. It creates positive emotions. Like if you're literally smiling and laughing, it really is like you're tricking your body. You're tricking your body to like not feeling stressed. And it also facilitates more positive social interactions. Like if you're able to kind of laugh a situation off with a friend, you're more likely to kind of bond in that moment and reduce stress. So good sense of humor makes situations less threatening, increases positive emotions, leads to more rewarding social interactions, and also able to take yourself less seriously means we're more likely to experience, stress in a way that is, that doesn't tax our resources and reduce our wellness. Positive interpretation or reinterpretation is another way. For example, we experience a stressor, and another way, kind of looking for that silver lining, recognizing, okay, well, this sucks, but things could have been worse. Or, looking at a bad situation and being able to find that silver lining. There's a lot of research that shows these reinterpretations can be a way to buffer from stress. So that's appraisal focus. Now we'll look at problem focused constructive coping. So we'll look at 4 steps of systematic problem solving. We'll discuss the adaptive value of asking for help. And also you should be able to describe how people's time orientation might also influence their ability to manage their time effectively. So when it comes to problem solving, there is a systematic approach to problem solving, and there's a lot of evidence that shows kind of taking this approach, developing problem solving skills. It can develop, it's like a muscle. It literally is a muscle that can be developed and trained and mastered with experience. So really the first things that you can do, the steps that you can do to use this kind of systematic approach is be very clear about what the problem is. The more detailed and clear you are, the better you can address it. Generate alternatives, like maybe not just one solution, but think of several solutions and evaluate the alternatives, and select your best course of action, and then take action, but also don't be rigid in how you take action, be willing to make changes and adapt as things go. If one type of problem solving isn't working, go back to your list and realize, hey, maybe I need to take a different approach. So being flexible is really the key there. Be willing to ask for help. I know that's very difficult. Sometimes people are, myself included, it's not always easy to ask for help. But if you have the resources of friends, family, loved ones, coworkers, neighbors, there's a lot of evidence that shows it can be helpful to use those resources. We do see, in terms of cultural factors, individuals who come from, for example, Asian ethnicity group, Asian Americans, more individuals who come from collectivist cultures are less likely to seek help, maybe from others. And this is also based in this tendency, kind of psychologically thinking in collectivistic terms, like, I don't want to burden other people with my problems, so I need to figure out how to way to do that. And we sort of see the opposite, perhaps, in individualistic cultures. We're perhaps more like, people from those cultures maybe perhaps more likely to reach out. Another way we can cope in a problem-focused manner in terms of coping is improving our time management. A source of stress for a lot of people is thinking, and myself included, I feel this way a lot, is, just don't have enough time in the day. Like, oh my gosh, 24 hours is never enough. If I only had 25 or 26. But I think, that is a big source of stress. So being able to manage your time effectively can go a long way to coping with stress. Individuals will vary in terms of how, in terms of time. Some people will be more future oriented. Some people will be more present oriented, and that will reflect in terms of how they manage their time. Future oriented individuals are less likely to procrastinate. They're better able to meet their goals and commitments because they see the goal ahead of time, and they might plan out ahead, break that into sub goals and work towards their overall goal. Regardless of your future or present oriented, all of us really could benefit by being better at managing our time, which could be just simply cutting out distractions or being more focused. Things like that can go a long way. Okay, lastly, in terms of coping, we're going to look at emotion-focused coping. So your objectives will be to clarify the nature and value of emotional intelligence, analyze the adaptive value of expressing your emotions, discuss the importance of managing hostility and forgiving others, understanding how exercise can foster improved emotional function, and also being able to summarize the evidence of adaptive value of things like meditation, relaxation, spirituality. All have been shown as effective emotionally coping constructive methods. The ability to use emotion-focused coping a lot of times comes down to our emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence, if you remember from intro psych, is our ability to understand, express our emotions, use our emotions, and then also understand the emotions of other people and regulate our own emotions. So there's a lot of things that kind of fall under this umbrella of emotional intelligence. But you would think the more emotionally intelligent you are, the more you would be able to effectively use emotion-focused coping strategies. So emotional intelligence has 4 components: accurately perceiving emotions in yourself and others, knowing how your emotions shape your thinking, understanding that their emotions are complex and sometimes even contradictory, and being able to regulate emotions, even negative ones. People who are highly emotional intelligent tend to experience better overall social interactions. They enjoy more mental and physical health, more effective as leaders, more likely to use problem-focused coping when they're dealing with anxiety, versus contrast at work. Low emotional intelligence oftentimes is associated with burnout, which we talked about in chapter 3. It is also important to express your emotions. There is a lot of efforts that are used to suppress emotions, especially anger, which research shows that actually increases stress and increases arousal, which is sort of counterintuitive. Emotional disclosure, not being angry and getting your emotions out in a non-productive way, but disclosing your emotions is associated with better mood, more positive self-perception, better physical and mental health. So overall, letting your emotions out in terms of disclosure is a good thing. Another aspect of emotion coping is forgiveness. Really forgiving people who transgress against us, perceived transgressions, whether they're real or not. There's a lot of evidence that shows it goes counter to our instinct. A lot of times when people harm us, we want to remember that and hold it against us. But there's also a lot of evidence that shows it's better overall for our well-being to forgive. Don't necessarily have to forget, but forgiveness is really helpful. Another way to deal with the emotions of stress is to exercise. Getting regular exercise is really, it's strongly associated with increased emotional control and then less emotional stress. But it's hard. Like, exercise is not easy. Like, I love exercise, but it's not easy. And there are plenty of days that, I realize that there are easier things I could be doing with my time in my day. So really, in order to achieve the benefits of exercise, you have to want it. You have to engage in an aerobic exercise, which is exercise that gets your heart rate up, but it's not, so high that you can't talk to somebody. So walks, light jogs, things like that, and exercise on a regular basis. Be consistent about it. Those are really getting the maximum benefits as far as mental, physical health is concerned. Meditation is another way of coping with stress. Meditation is where, oftentimes we might there's a lot of exercises that fall under the umbrella of meditation, but a lot of times meditation usually is a form of focusing your attention in some sort of non-analytical way, maybe on the present moment, maybe on your breath, some sort of stimulus like that. A lot of benefits for it, including decreased heart rate, decreased respiration, takes you out of fight or flight, eliminates carbon dioxide. It's also associated with a deeper state of relaxation. Oops. That's like a weird slide, I guess. That's empty. Don't know why that's there. Sorry, I should have known that. Meditation also, in terms of relaxation and meditation, the benefits are lower stress hormones, lower anxiety, better overall mood, and a greater sense of control. I personally practice meditating every day and cannot say enough good things about it. It is as part of a series of relaxation techniques. It's not the only one. Benson also talks about, techniques that can induce the relaxation response, basically induce the parasympathetic nervous system to counteract fight or flight with rest and digest. We want to look for a quiet environment, some kind of mental device. Maybe it's your breath, maybe it's a mantra. having a passive attitude, just being open to whatever happens, and finding yourself in a comfortable position, maybe in a seated position or lying down in a way that's not going to, lead to back pain or distractions or, things like that. Spirituality is also a way we can cope with stress. That's not the same thing as religion. Spirituality is just kind of, being aware that there are things that are, in this world that are bigger than ourselves, and it's a pretty effective way of coping. It's kind of related to, it's part of this process of reappraisal, forgiveness, meditation, social support. It kind of embraces all of these things. And there's a lot of evidence that shows it's better connected to physical, mental health, which is, kind of embracing the forgiveness aspect, a lot of benefits there. But if we're talking about religion, spirituality that tends to focus on punishment and guilt, that is not so good for harm, for mental health. Like you hear all the time, like jokingly, you hear people refer to like Catholic or Jewish guilt, growing up in a Catholic or Jewish household, maybe their parents guilted them, through those religious and spiritual lenses. That kind of behavior might be considered harmful to mental health, but embracing some of these other aspects, not so much. Okay, now we'll look at kind of some research application to cope with stress, a way to be more effective with your time. So you should be able to explain the 5 common causes of time waste, identify causes and consequences of procrastination, and summarize advice on managing your time more effectively. So kind of the big 5 or big 6 when it comes to wasted time: inability to set or stick to priorities, inability to say no, inability to delegate responsibility, taking it all on yourself, inability to throw things away, inability to avoid interruptions, inability to accept anything less than perfection. If you are dealing with one or more of these are impediments to your time. And in fact, these kind of impediments might create more stress or make it more difficult to cope with stress. It might lead to more procrastination or wasting time. 70 to 90% of college students put off academic assignments, sometimes till the very last day. I don't know what the data is on that. However, they claim they benefit from this working well under pressure, but in fact, you're probably causing yourself more stress. Why do students procrastinate, you might wonder? One, desire to minimize the time on task. You'd rather do other things. You'd rather hang with your friends. You'd rather watch Netflix. I don't blame you. Those things are more fun, but they aren't conducive to dealing with the actual problem, doing your coursework. Maybe optimizing efficiency. You think I'm more efficient this way if I just put it all at the end. Close proximity to reward. You often get rewarded for it, especially in high school. A lot of students, as they transition from high school to college, figure out, I could procrastinate and relax and, slack off in high school and get A's, but it doesn't necessarily work in college. Procrastinators compared to non-procrastinators, however, experience more stress, more anxiety, and more health problems. So while it might work temporarily, long-term, probably not the best solution. So what can you do to manage your time more effectively? Monitor the use of your time. Like, be aware of how you use your time, document it, keep track of it. Be specific about your goals and clarify your goals. Plan activities you want to use, while using a schedule, having a planner, breaking your day up. Protect the prime time hours of your day. Like, you should block off certain times of your day where you're most effective, and be okay and tell others, like, hey, I'm going to be busy during this time. I have my do not disturb on during this time, and I'm not taking calls. I'm not taking texts. I'm not checking social media. Also, when it comes to efficiency, handle emails and papers only once. Don't multitask. Group similar tasks together, tackle them one at a time, make use of your downtime, and strategically build in time to relax. Like, you can't just go all the time. You will literally burn yourself out. So here is an ideal look at a way you could structure your schedule from 7 to 11, and figure out, based on your schedule, when you can find times to rest, when you can find times to work. So be diligent about blocking off certain times. So anyways, that's chapter 4. We will come back and jump into chapter 5 next. Let me know if you have any questions. Drop me an email, drop some notes in the comments. Otherwise, I'll see you around for chapter 5. Peace.